Everyone, and welcome. My name is Ilya Tovbis. I'm the artistic and managing director of J by J, the festival at which you have hopefully caught the film we'll be discussing tonight, Winter Journey. And we have with us the subject of the film, someone whose life and especially whose family have become familiar with, Martin Goldsmith, to discuss the film. I'm going to give a little bit of his bio. I'm going to start in with a couple of my own questions, but most of what we like to do in these Q&As, which have been quite well attended, and I think tonight's is as well, is take questions from the audience. So do feel free to already start putting those questions into the chat or to do so throughout the conversation. There are two different ways that people are experiencing this conversation. Don't feel a fear of missing out. They're exactly the same. One is on our Eventive streaming platform. If you're there, please use the chat function to ask questions. If you are experiencing this through Zoom, then please use the Q&A function. Zoom has both chat and Q&A. We prefer it if you use the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So Martin Goldsmith, as many of you know, is the author of Alex's Wake, Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance, which is the story of his grandfather and uncle, who were two of more than 900 passengers on the ill-fated Jewish refugee ship, the St. Louis, in 1939, and also his own 6-week journey in their footsteps in 2011. His first book, The Indistinguishable Symphony, A True Story of Music and Love in Nazi Germany, told the story of the Jewish Culture Bund, the all-Jewish performing arts ensemble. Again, if you've already seen the film, you're familiar with it if you had not been before, which was maintained by the Nazis between 33 and 41. And it's an ensemble that, of course, included Mr. Goldsmith's parents and is the basis in large part for this film that you saw. Also, if you have not yet had a chance to see the film, it is playing on our platform through Thursday. You can catch it all the way until 11:59 p.m. on Thursday evening. So do certainly head to JXJDC and watch it, or tell someone if you like the film to head over there and watch it. If you didn't like it, please do keep that to yourself, but I'm sure there's not many in the audience that felt that way. Additionally, Mr. Goldsmith had been a classical music radio programmer and presenter for 49 years. He semi-retired a couple of years ago from Sirius XM satellite radio in Washington, D.C., where he now hosts music programs on weekend afternoons. And for 10 years, from 89 to 99, he serves as the host of Performance Today, which is NPR's daily classic music program. There's a lot more to his credit, but I'd like to get to the conversation. So first, Martin, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ilya. It was a great honor to be invited.
Of course. So I'll start sort of with an easy question, and I don't think they'll get terribly harder from here, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how this story went from book to film, and in particular, you're the subject, you're not the director of the film. To what degree were you involved in the creative process, and what did that collaboration with the director and the others making the film, what shape did that take?
Well, it all began with an email that came literally out of the blue, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, from this Danish filmmaker I had not heard of before, Anders Ostergaard. And he asked if I would be interested in his taking The Inextinguishable Symphony and turning it into a film. And I can't remember precisely. It is possible that when I got that first email, I thought that I was being harangued by a Nigerian ex-president or something like that. I may have actually ignored the first email, but luckily, Honors sent me a second email, which I did answer. I said, sure, I'd be very interested. I think Honors caught the very next plane out of Copenhagen to Washington, D.C., and he came to the house, and we talked for hours, and I immediately felt an artistic kinship with Honors. He brought with him a DVD of a film he made in a few years ago called 1989, about the fall of the wall and the tumultuous times unleashed by that very important event. And that was where I first came into contact with his, what in the publishing world is referred to as narrative nonfiction, which is to say a true story, but told dramatically. In other words, there's a famous moment in the history of 1989 in late October of that year, when the East German president Erich Honecker flew to Moscow to talk with Mikhail Gorbachev. And the upshot of that discussion was that Gorbachev told Honecker that he would not send Soviet tanks to defend the wall. That obviously led to the wall being breached and everything that came thereafter, the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, for instance. But Honors found two actors, one to play Honecker, one to play Gorbachev, and created a conversation. So you hear the two of them talking, and they end up at the place where the conversation, in fact, ended, but it was a more dramatic telling of the story. So I was quite intrigued by his techniques, and over the course of several years, we spoke of his ideas and a few ideas of mine. And in the last few weeks of 2017, Honors gave me the exciting news that he had cast the great actor Bruno Ganz as my father. Bruno Ganz, probably best known for Wings of Desire, the Wim Wenders film, and his portrayal of Adolf Hitler in the film Downfall of maybe 15 years ago. So the shooting in Tucson took place in January of 2018. That summer, Bruno was scheduled to perform with, at the Salzburg Music Festival in Austria. And in the middle of his run there, he collapsed, was taken home to Zurich, and he was in a weakened condition, but he was determined to conclude work on the film. And in late September, early October, Honors and his sound crew went to Zurich and visited Bruno in his home, where he recorded his end of some of the phone calls you see in the film. And within a few weeks, Bruno had died at age 77. He's a superb, superb actor. And as it happens, Winter Journey was his very last work.
So I wanted to come back to something you mentioned that, of course, was obvious to anyone that's already watched the film, and that it completely eschews standard conventional documentary filmmaking. There's practically, the only talking head is really reenactments of your father by Bruno Ganz. There's no historians, academics, subject matter experts giving truth to the history. They're almost like Socratic dialogues in a way. It's the film evolves from a conversation between you and your father with a little bit of narration from your character to fill in some of the gaps as well. And you knew this having met with Anders and understanding his prior film history. And to my eye, it's something that's incredibly engaging, personal, and also vulnerable. That there's a certain sense of it being more ephemeral, more emotional than perhaps a standard documentary. When you finally saw the finished product for the first time yourself, did you feel like it properly evoked the book? Did it bring dimensions that you didn't expect? And not just the book, but of course your personal history and research as well. What effect did those stylistic choices have on you?
Well, I was utterly captivated. When I first saw it, from the beginning, I knew it was not going to be a film that I might have made myself, though I have no skills as a filmmaker. I would have told it in a more feature film sort of way. I might have played up the love story between my father and my mother a bit more. But what Honors did was, I think, quite extraordinary. As you say, he leaves a good deal to the imagination and to the sense and sensibility of the viewer. He doesn't, as you say, present a linear description of everything, but it's very impressionistic in a way. And of course, his technique of using the green screen to place actors in actual still photographs is astounding. I mean, that scene towards the end of the film, when my father, as a young man, goes to Gestapo headquarters and walks up the ornate marble staircase of Gestapo headquarters. In fact, the actor is walking up a rickety flight of plywood stairs that the crew has hammered together and is actually holding on to keep it from collapsing. But because of the green screen and because the carpenters built these steps the requisite distance apart, it appears as if young Günther is walking up the stairs in that formidable place. So I was quite captivated, and I think every time I've seen it, and I have to confess, I've probably seen it a good dozen times, if not more, it grows on me every time.
And what about Bruno Gantz's performance? As you mentioned, he's a towering actor, a great actor. In addition to films you mentioned, American Friend is one of my favorites, where he has a central role. Did you find, as someone that obviously knew your father intimately, did you find he did a credible job as your father, or was it not even the intent? Was the intent more to paint a picture of an idea rather than of the man himself?
When I met Bruno in Tucson in January of 2018, I expected that he would sort of take me by the sleeve and walk into a corner and said, "Now, Martin, tell me everything you can possibly remember about your father as it relates to his way of speaking or his physical characteristics. Did he walk like this? Did he hold his coffee cup like that?" So I expected that I would be sort of grilled by Bruno. In fact, it was completely the opposite. He wanted nothing to do with anything having to do with learning about this George Goldsmith. He based his character on the script and on his genius as an actor. And the result is eerie in that, because, I mean, again, we had no conversation about physical characteristics or vocal characteristics of my father. But there are times watching the film that I forget that I'm watching Bruno Ganz. There are certain gestures that he developed that were uncannily like my father. And one of my favorite moments in the entire film is when Bruno tells the story of his landlord in Berlin and how the landlord, Adolf Cohen, keeps a suitcase by the door in case the Gestapo comes for him. And my father relates his conversation with Herr Cohen, and why do you keep the suitcase by the door? Well, in case the Gestapo comes for me, or when the Gestapo comes for me. And my father says, "What do you mean?" And Adolf Cohen says, "Don't you know we're all going to be burned?" And my father says, "Oh, these are all rumors, fairy tales. Don't believe anything you hear." And Adolf Cohen looks at him, and my father said that Adolf Cohen said, "You will remember Adolf Cohen." That entire part of the script, I quote, wrote, unquote, but in fact, that was verbatim what my father had said to me. And every time I see that scene, Bruno Ganz is just a dead ringer for my father. The way he spoke, the words he emphasized, he was just really uncanny. So he totally embodied my father in not only physically but emotionally, and all the stuff that's going on beneath the surface and behind his eyes. I think Bruno was astoundingly good.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to a few questions from the audience now. We have a question from Laura Gins. She asks or observes that you seem angry with your father at times in the film, especially I think on that last scene or second to last scene, and that you reference a tough childhood. And she was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about the earlier years.
Yes, I wouldn't call it a tough childhood at all. I mean, goodness, given certainly what we're all dealing with today, it was a walk in the park, as they say. But my father, one of the very poignant things I learned in doing research for the book, The Inextinguishable Symphony, was when I interviewed the youngest member of the Kulturbund Orchestra, a fellow by the name of Henry Meyer, who was sent to Auschwitz along with his brother. His brother was murdered in Auschwitz. Henry survived, came to this country, and for many years was the second violinist of the La Salle String Quartet, headquartered in Cincinnati. But he knew my parents in the Kulturbund, and he told me that my father was the life of the party. He was always ready to go to some party after a concert. He was good-natured, he sang, he danced, and that was not the man I knew growing up. Obviously, he was devastated by what he learned in those letters that are produced there at the end of the film. So he and I butted heads frequently, but then fathers and sons do that. I suppose. And the anger that I felt was that he had, because he felt so guilty, he, as an act of penance, gave up his flute. He was a musician through and through, and yet he spent most of the rest of his professional life selling furniture at a department store. And it upset me then. It still to this day upsets me that my father, while trying to do the right thing, I guess, because he probably could not have saved his family as much as he might have tried to, but rather than perhaps pursuing music in another way, perhaps teaching the flute or teaching the elements of musical style, he chose to make himself miserable selling furniture. And I've often, I mean, since my father's death, I've often recreated conversations with him. And I feel immense pity for him, and immense love for him, and immense frustration with him. And I think what you see in that final scene, and also that the bar mitzvah scene, where he contends that he can't remember his bar mitzvah, which I defy most people to find anybody who will forget their bar mitzvah. But he was just so adamant that he was not a Jew. You know, he said, Adolf Hitler declared that I'm a Jew. I choose not to be. And so we went round and round the mulberry bush on that on numerous occasions. So I don't think we had a bad relationship, but I think what you saw there is my frustration and my sorrow for my father sort of bursting out at that moment.
So we have a couple of other questions that nibble around the answer you just gave. I think some of this might be a little repetitive, but there's some interesting points to bring out of it. One comes from Philip Brown, who asks about your sharp criticism of your father for spending his time working in the furniture store, which you just addressed. And he specifically says that he disappoints you and in the film, at least, and I don't know how much this is verite and how much is made up, it says when he got up and walked away and you couldn't find him, weren't you worried? Now, again, I don't know if that's beat for beat what happened in real life or not. So you can fill us in. But was it a matter? It didn't seem like it was embarrassment. It really seemed like you wanted him to find joy and happiness and meaning in a way that he just went away from because of seeking penance, as you put it.
Yes, and I thought it was also very poignant when, again, in 1981, my mother retired from her position with the Cleveland Orchestra, and my father retired from his job at the furniture department in the department store, and they retired to Tucson. And they lived in a little condo very similar to the one that the scenes were shot at. Honors wanted different angles, and so he found a condo sort of right around the corner from where my parents lived. But when my father would meet new people and they would say, "Oh, so George, before your retirement, what did you do?" My father invariably said, "I was a musician." He obviously was proud of being a musician and not at all proud of selling furniture. So yes, it was not that I was frustrated by his inability to find joy in the world. I mean, he did, but in his own very personal way. And I mean, that at the very beginning of the film, when he quotes the great opening song of the great song cycle Winterreise, Winter Journey by Franz Schubert, that was a phrase that he would often repeat. Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd bin ich wieder aus. A stranger I came, a stranger I departed. He felt like a stranger in a strange land. And I know that Honors was just captivated by the thought of this North German, the person who, as Bruno says in that opening scene, likes 4 seasons and a bit of green grass, found himself in the desert, surrounded by cacti and lizards and aspects of stunning scenery that nevertheless has nothing to do with where my father felt at home. So sort of a rambling answer, sorry about that.
There's some really interesting bits in there. There's a few questions here from Dina Gold, who's one of our J by J council members. I'll start with one of them. I might return to a few others. She asks how old you were when your father showed you the collection of old letters he received from the family left behind in Europe. And she also observes that it seems like you were an adult and they came as a terrible revelation to you.
How old was I? Probably in my middle 40s. Again, as I say right at the very beginning of the film, my brother once asked my father, "Hey, how come we don't have grandparents? How come we don't have aunts and uncles? All of our friends, go over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house at Thanksgiving. Where are all our relatives?" And my father said, "They died in the war." End of story. And as I write in the book, it seems as if we never talked about what had happened in Germany for the same reason we never discussed bauxite mining in Peru. These were just two subjects that would never come up at the dinner table or in the family room or anything like that. It just was not spoken of. And my brother and I, we were never shushed. We were never told, don't speak of that issue. But we came to sort of inherit the realization, the knowledge that that was just an off-limits topic. So I remember in 1971 going to see the film Cabaret with Liza Minnelli and Joel Grey and Michael York. And in that very famous chilling scene when they're out in the country and this couple of brown shirt kids at a Bierstube start singing "Tomorrow Belongs to Me," which is a very effective, very chilling moment in Cabaret. And I remember coming out of the movie theater and thinking to myself, I vaguely realized that I have some connection to what happened back then. And it was sort of left to me to discover on my own, to a certain extent, what had happened to my family. And that gave rise to my starting the questions that led to the scenes that are reenacted in the film. But yes, I'm sorry, I realized I didn't quite answer the question. Yes, when I found out the details, when I read, I had to have those letters translated. And when I read what turned out to be my grandfather's very last letter to my father, again, quoted in the film, we've described to you our conditions here at the camp of Les Milles. This will be my last attempt to tell you about this. If you don't move heaven and earth to get us out of here, that's up to you, but it will be on your conscience. And I felt that like a hammer blow when I read that. And I could see how that would have affected my father profoundly. And when I found out all the details of what had happened to my family, my grandfather and uncle murdered in Auschwitz, my grandmother and aunt murdered in a forest outside of Riga, it came as a tremendous shock.
And was there anything that your father, this is another question that somebody asked, is that your father was able to do to address those pleas, or was he just too far away and had no power to do anything other than receive the postcards?
Well, here's where things get a bit ambiguous. Occasionally, as is mentioned briefly in the film, when my parents managed to arrive in the United States in June of 1941, very much just in time as the Kulturbund was dissolved in September of 1941, and everybody who hadn't gotten out by then were sent to the camps. When my parents arrived, they both got very menial jobs and menial paying jobs. But every now and then, my father was able to scrape together $25, and via the Quakers, he was able to send that money to my grandfather and uncle in the camps, first in Rivesaltes and then in Les Milles in France. So he did, in a sense, he did what he could financially. But there was that, the inconvenient fact that, again, my parents arrived in New York City in June of 1941. In October of 41, they managed to land jobs as musicians at a music festival in South Carolina. And they took the train from New York down to Carolina, passing through Washington, D.C. twice on their way south and then on their way back north. And neither time did my father get off the train to walk up to Capitol Hill to knock on some doors where he might have found the right person who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who might have been able to do something to get my grandfather and uncle out of Camp Les Milles, because there many prisoners at Les Milles did in fact manage to get out if they were spoken for. And my father didn't get off the train either of those times. And I know that he felt horribly guilty. The odds are that if he had gotten off that train, nothing would have changed, because it was certainly not an easy task to get through, first of all, the American red tape and the French red tape. But the fact remains that he didn't do everything he possibly could have done. And I think that ate at him the rest of his life.
Ken Aiken asks if your father was aware of what happened to his father and brother. You just shared with us about them being murdered in Auschwitz and Riga. Was that something your father knew, or something that your research dug up later on?
My father knew in the late 80s, and hi Ken, by the way, in the late 80s, my father contacted the International Red Cross and found out that his father had perished in Auschwitz. But there were no details. And he didn't know, the report did not mention his uncle, or I'm sorry, my uncle, his younger brother. And he knew that his mother and younger sister had been deported to Riga in Latvia, but that was all he knew. He assumed that they were taken to the Riga ghetto, where they may have perished there. But thanks to the research I was able to do for the first book, and thanks especially to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, I was able to find out that the reason my uncle's fate was not immediately discoverable was that he was known as Helmut Goldschmidt. In school, all his friends, everybody called him Helmut, but on his birth certificate, his name was Klaus Helmut Goldschmidt. And once I figured that out, I was able to relay that to the Holocaust Museum. They were able to find out the details that when my grandfather and uncle arrived from France in Auschwitz in August of 1942, my grandfather was sent immediately to the gas chamber at age 63. He was considered too old to work. My uncle, who was 21 years old at the time, was sent to a brick factory in Auschwitz, where he survived for 2 months before succumbing on October 9th of 1942. So my father didn't know those details. And then he didn't know also what I learned recently about my grandmother and aunt, who were deported to Riga, but they didn't actually make it into downtown Riga. Their train stopped on the outskirts of Riga, where they were loaded onto a truck, along with other people who had been on that train, taken to a forest called Bikernitsky Forest near Riga, where they were ordered to strip off their clothing, lie face down in a trench that had been dug by soldiers, where they were immediately shot in the back of the head. There were two of about 35,000 Jews who were executed in that forest, found after the war in about 50 unmarked mass graves.
Returning to an earlier theme, Tom Plotz asks if your father gave up the flute completely, or did he still play at home? And I'd like to expand on that a little bit, is at least in the film, and again, maybe this is completely accurate, maybe it's a little bit stylized, but his memory for music seemed the sharpest. There are things that he couldn't necessarily remember, or at least ostensibly claimed not to, but at any moment when he would ask what was playing or what you played, he immediately knew what the piece was and remembered what moment in the piece. So could you talk a little bit, especially after moving to America, what was his relationship to music like? Did he continue to play the flute, and is that accurate? Did he have the sort of photographic memory or auditory, whatever the version of that is, or photographic memory for music?
Well, let's see, I'll answer the second question last, I guess. He did, in fact, virtually completely give up the flute. My brother, as it happens, took up the flute, playing in a band in high school in St. Louis. And he, in fact, inherited my father's flute. And there were maybe one or two, maybe three times that I can recall that my brother would be playing something and rehearsing on the flute, practicing the flute. And he'd say to my father, "This passage here is giving me trouble. Could you demonstrate how it's done?" And my father would take down the flute, and he would take the flute from my brother and demonstrate fingerings and breath control and so on. So he would occasionally, I may have heard him play 2 or 3 times, but that was it. He never, and then my mother had chamber music concerts at our house frequently, but my father never joined in. He with the exception of those examples that he played for my brother, I never heard him play the flute. But yes, he did have a photographic memory for certain things, not only music. Yes, he knew that the Pathétique Symphony was the main work on the program when he and my mother met in Frankfurt. And something that is not mentioned in the film, which I wish there'd been time for, but shortly after those concerts occurred, my father did indeed move to Stockholm. He found an apartment over a milk bar in Stockholm. And within a few days, he sent my mother a very slim volume of poet Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. And he inscribed the book on the inside cover to Rosemary Gumpert in memory of 2 concerts and Tchaikovsky in Munich and Frankfurt, and he signed it GG. So the fact that they played the 6th Symphony by Tchaikovsky was very much on his mind. And as I say in the film, it's one of your favorite pieces, and he says, yes, it is. And he remembered that when on the morning after Kristallnacht, when he walked through the rubble of Dusseldorf to Rosemary's, my mother's father's house, he remembered that they were rehearsing this piece by Beethoven for flute, violin, and viola. And he remembered the Goldmark Symphony and so on. And as I say, he told me about that New Year's Eve when he and my mother, quote, made love for the first time, unquote. And in the film, I say TMI. And certain things he remembered very, very clearly, other things he did not remember at all.
Let's go in a slightly different direction. Philip Brown asked an interesting question. He talks about being surprised that your father chose to return to Oldenburg with you and your mother and your brother when you were quite young. What motivated him to go back? The question is, do you personally have vivid memories of the visit? The second part, I imagine you do, because that's how they found their way into the film. But the first part is curious because he couldn't bring himself to go in the house. He turned right around and went in the other direction as fast as he could. But he wanted to go back. Some part of him did want to recreate that nostalgic childhood.
Well, this was 1962. It was 21 years after they had escaped barely with their lives to the United States. And I was 10 years old at the time. My brother was 13. And I don't remember all the details, but for some reason, they managed to get the money together and have the time to make their first return visit to Europe since their flight in 1941. I wasn't quite aware of it at the moment, but shortly after we had come back, my father, we took something called Icelandic Airlines. We took the train from St. Louis to New York, flew Icelandic Airlines from New York to Gander, Newfoundland, then to Reykjavik Iceland, and then to Luxembourg. We landed in Luxembourg and then rented a car and drove the few miles to the German border. And my father remembers, he was at the wheel, and remembers the crossing guard, or the customs guy, looking at him and asking for his papers. My father looking up at him, thinking, where were you 21 years ago? What did you do? And he was profoundly uncomfortable crossing the border into Germany. But it was always his contention that Germany was his country, but the Nazis were the interlopers, that he belonged there. He did, obviously, feelings of guilt caused him to avoid visiting his beautiful house on the Gartenstrasse in Oldenburg, then in 1962. But 30 years later, in 1992, the year I turned 40, I was in Europe, and my father was in Europe, and we met in Oldenburg. And we met, he showed me the house, the outside of the beautiful house where he lived. He showed me the store that his father had run, the Haus der Mode, the House of Fashion in downtown Oldenburg. And for the rest of his life, he loved going back to Germany. He felt very German. He loved German lieder. I mean, it's through him that I developed my appreciation for Schubert songs and Schumann songs and Brahms songs. Alas, his last 5 years were clouded by Alzheimer's, but I would visit him frequently at the Alzheimer's facility near here. And so many times we would plan a trip that I knew would never take place, but he so much wanted to go back to Oldenburg, and we came up with a plan. We'd fly to Amsterdam, then we'd take the train from Amsterdam to Oldenburg. He loved trains. He just absolutely loved being on a train. And we discussed all these plans, how we would show up we would take the train to Oldenburg, and he would show me the beautiful ducal gardens in Oldenburg, and we'd buy bread and toss them to the swans and the ducks. And he had all these very detailed fantasies about going back to Germany, which I always found terribly poignant.
A number of people have asked about your mother, because she wasn't as much the subject, clearly, of the film. It was mostly about your father and your relationship with your father. And essentially, they would just like to know if you could tell us a little bit more about her, who she was and how she figured into the story.
Yes, that's one of the things that, obviously, if I had made a film, my mother would have been a far more important character. Just parenthetically, I'd like to say there are a couple of places towards the end of the film, I think during the Carl Nielsen Inextinguishable Symphony sequence, where you see still photographs of the orchestra, and you see the young actor playing my father, who's sort of green screened into the flute section. But then to my father's left, there's a photograph of the woman, the actress playing my mother, and immediately to her right in the photograph is my actual mother. So if you plan to go back and see the film again, the woman sitting to the right of that woman is in fact my mom. What can I tell you about her? She was apparently a very, very, very good violist. My father also would sort of deflect, would perhaps use my mom as an excuse when I would say, why didn't you audition for the St. Louis Symphony? And he said, well, your mother was really the better musician of the two of us. She was very, very good. She was only the third woman hired by the formidable conductor George Sell, who ran the Cleveland Orchestra. And as I say, she was the third woman hired in what had been an all male-dominated orchestra. She had a great sense of humor. Gosh, there's so many things I could tell about her. She fixed up, again, you'll remember from the film, she made some curtains for their little apartment on Prinzenstrasse, and she had a weakness for detective novels. She would read Ellery Queen and Mike Hammer mysteries, and she was a great gardener. She had a real green thumb. I could go on, but those are just a few memories.
It raises a quick minor point for me. There was a number of shots towards the end where A Bend in the Road, the Nicholas Sparks book, was pretty clearly in frame, seemingly on purpose. Is that a book that meant something specific to your father, which would have been towards the end of his life, that it even came out, or yourself, or is that something else?
Well, as it happens, it was an important book to my father. I mean, he read it and enjoyed it. But I don't think I ever mentioned it to Honors. And I guess when he dressed the set, he found that book and thought, well, this will make sense. But he had no way of knowing that my father had read it. It was sort of a happy coincidence. I did notice it when I first saw that scene.
There's some interesting sort of artistic parallels in terms of the theme and kind of the mixture of bittersweet and bitterness over death and its mixing with love. That I was wondering if that was an artistic decision or one that was closer to your family. Going back to a couple of other questions from the audience. We have one from Sarah Kagan, also on your mother, and she's wondering about the fate of her family. Did she also lose her whole family in the show, or was their outcome different?
My mother was an only child. Her father, Julian Gumpert, for whom I am middle named, I'm Martin Julian Goldsmith. Julian Gumpert was a very personable violinist and apparently a very good teacher. My mother would go on at great length at what a fabulous teacher her dad was. He started her on the violin when she was 3 years old and switched her to the viola when she was 7, saying there are many more good violinists than there are violists. And if you learn to play the viola, you'll probably secure yourself a job in many a symphony orchestra, which turned out to be true. He was also a bit of a rat. He carried on a number of affairs with young women who were students at his conservatory. And at one point, he left Germany with, well, let me go back just a moment earlier, recall that when my parents got married, about a month after Kristallnacht, on December 13th, Friday, December 13th, 1938, the marriage was officiated by a Nazi in his brown uniform, standing in his office, which was dominated by a floor-to-ceiling portrait of Adolf Hitler, with his hand resting on the head of a German shepherd, both of them looking out over the mountains of Berchtesgaden. And my father recalled that his new father-in-law, Julian Gumpert, was just seemingly on the best of terms with this Nazi official. They shook hands, they laughed, they carried on, they told jokes. My father said, it's impossible to know what the situation was, because there's always the possibility that Julian was some sort of, not collaborator, but someone who made his peace with the Nazis. But my father also said that Julian was the original hail fellow well met. He got on with everybody, my father said, from the streetcar conductor to the man who delivered coal every month, to policemen, to everybody he knew. He was friendly to everybody. So that was always a bit of a mystery as to how and why that Nazi official got on so well with my grandfather. But then it turns out that my grandfather, Julian, left Germany with a woman not his wife and made it to Ecuador, where almost immediately, if you believe in karma, he keeled over from a heart attack brought on by the high altitude. His wife, my mother's mother, moved in with my father's mother and younger sister in Berlin. And unfortunately, in March of 1942, 7 months before my grandmother and aunt were deported, my other grandmother, my mother's mom, was deported to Travnicki in Poland, where she was murdered.
So something you've mentioned a couple of times, to go in a slightly different direction, is your father's Jewish identity and his, he essentially did not feel Jewish other than when he was persecuted for it, or at least that's the way it comes across in the film. And I think from your answers, that seems credible as well. That it was sort of stamped upon him that Kristallnacht and all the other moments of persecution, the time in the concert hall when he saw the elderly couple being abused, those were the moments when he was kicked out of music school. Those were the moments that made him feel Jewish, not the bar mitzvah that he ostensibly forgot, which does seem a little far-fetched, and nothing else. But yourself, I mean, you clearly have spent much of your life studying their history and feeling close kinship, if if not religiously speaking, at least historically and ethnically and culturally interested in it. Can you talk a little bit about your own Jewish identity and how you feel like it departs from or draws from your father's experience?
Yes, gladly. Yes, as I think as I think Bruno says in the film at one point, Adolf Hitler decided I was a Jew. I choose not to be a Jew. He often told me about unhappy memories of being in Oldenburg in the late 1920s. And for some reason, even though I've always thought of garlic as being an Italian seasoning, apparently in the Germany of the 1920s, garlic was attached to Jews. And my father remembers getting on a streetcar and having some, toughs look at him and sort of elaborately going, "I smell garlic, I smell garlic." And that affected my father to the point where he hated any dish that had garlic in it when he was older. He wanted nothing to do with being thought of as Jewish. And I guess from his point of view, to be a Jew was to be condemned, to be shunned, to be insulted, to have one's family murdered. So I can certainly, from that point of view, understand wanting to, as I guess one of the MGM heads famously coined the phrase, "include me out." If that's what it meant to be a Jew, my father said, "include me out." On the other hand, I didn't attend my first Seder until I was 16. We moved from St. Louis to Cleveland when my mom joined the Cleveland Orchestra, and virtually all of my friends were Jews. We lived in Shaker Heights, which was adjacent to Cleveland Heights, the big Jewish neighborhoods. So all of my friends were Jews. So I was invited to my first Seder when I was 16, and that in itself didn't necessarily mean anything to me. But again, there was that moment when I saw Cabaret, and I realized there was some connection there. And once I started doing research into this book and then the subsequent book, Alex's Wake, in which I followed in the footsteps of Alex and Helmut, I felt much more of a connection to the idea of being a Jew. One of the letters that my grandfather sent to my father from one of the camps he wrote it in late September, and he begins by saying, "On this New Year's morning, I'm using my blanket as a writing desk." So I knew that he obviously was aware that it was Rosh Hashanah, that he had at least that much of a Jewish identity. And the next time I'd gone to a Yom Kippur service and heard the Kol Nidre, the opening prayer from the Yom Kippur service, I realized that I was doing something at that moment that my grandfather had done. I was listening to the same very beautiful, haunting melody many, many years later, but it was the same thing. So it struck me that I really wanted to explore Judaism as a way to reach back across the generations to make some sort of contact with my murdered family. So in 2007, I began a 20-month study over at Temple Sinai on Military Road, which culminated in my becoming a bar mitzvah boy in June of 2008. So I became a man at age 55.
That's a nice line. Turning again in another direction, and we're getting close to the close here, but a couple more questions. One is about the music in the film. Some of it, I think, comes very directly from the moments in the story that this piece was playing, or your father was participating in an orchestra that was playing a piece. Did you have a hand at all as a music programmer and as someone that, of course, loves much of this music and helping steer the production towards certain picks?
I made a few suggestions, but again, Honors was the director, and directors, they call those shots. And for the most part, I really don't disagree with it. I mean, I think he uses the Tchaikovsky Pathétique Symphony extremely effectively. I might have used different parts of the Nielsen Symphony than he did, but I love the way he found, the way he introduces that first song from Winterreise and times it out so that Bruno speaking those lines are rhythmically correct with the music. Over the closing credits, he chose to use a portion of Beethoven's Archduke Trio, thinking that that would symbolize the re-owning of German culture by this expat. I would have preferred to use more from the Winterreise music just because I love it so much. So there are a few things that we disagreed on, but those are minor little quibbles, and I think he did a great job with the music.
Wonderful. And with that, I'd kind of just like to leave it, if you could catch people up. I'm assuming you're not done in your mind with this story or this film. What's next for this film? What's next for you as a writer and as a participant in the story?
Well, as it happens, just today I learned that the film has been chosen as one of the 3 primary films in next month's New York Jewish Film Festival, which normally takes place at Lincoln Center, but of course this year will be virtual. But that's an honor. It will be shown at festivals in Miami and Toronto in the coming months, and I think several others which have not quite been signed, sealed, and delivered. I hope at some point it will be available on a wider scale, but it may well be. I know there are talks afoot. And as for my writing, yes, I've written about my parents in the Inextinguishable Symphony. I wrote about my grandfather and uncle in Alex's Wake, and I would like to write about my grandmother and aunt, my grandmother Tony and my aunt Ava. They were, from what I can tell from their letters, they were just really interesting characters. One of my friends suggested that I should try to turn it into a play. I've never written for the stage before. That would be an interesting challenge. But I would like to tell their story because it's heartbreaking and beautiful. I mean, there's one letter that Ava, my aunt, wrote to my father, who was already in New York City. My father remembered Ava as, I mean, she was born with a malformed left leg, and it was operated on when she was just a little baby, but she walked with a limp the rest of her life. And for some reason, I've come to associate her with the character Laura in the Tennessee Williams play, The Glass Menagerie. My father remembered her, how did he put it, as a girl full of poetry and dreams. And to make ends meet, she got herself a job restocking the shelves at a Jewish pharmacy in Berlin. This was just weeks before she was deported along with my grandmother to Riga. And she wrote a letter to my father in which she said, I had to get up at 4:30 this morning to go to work, but when I went outside, I felt sorry for all of the people who were sleeping at home snug in their beds, because I was able to walk down the street all by myself and look up at the stars and how beautiful they were. And I thought I would like to write more about a girl like that.
Absolutely. And I know that it's certainly something I'll be looking out for, and hopefully our audience as well. With that, I'd just love to thank you again for spending this evening with us and for participating and telling the story first in book form and all the research that it took, and then of course, and then allowing for and helping for it to be made into this wonderful film. Thank you to all the audience that joined us this evening for the conversation. Again, if anyone's with us that has not yet seen the film, you still have a couple of days to do so. And even if you've already seen the film, please let others know. All the way through Thursday at midnight or 11:59, you can catch the film at jxjdc.org. Martin, again, thank you so much for being with us, and best of luck at your future screenings.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you very, very much.
All right, have a great night.
You too.